Alrighty. Is it time? It's time. All right. Perfect. All right. Okay. So let me get my pen. Can't believe it's midterm time already. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna give you a warning for today. Not about anything I'm gonna say. The laptop that I usually use for lectures is this Dell thing, which I like because it's got a kickstand on it, kind of like a Surface, but it's made by Dell, so it's worse. And in the last 2 days, just randomly, it will lose connection to the projector, and then it will not let me do anything until I reinstall all the drivers, which is a pain. I brought a backup. So if you're watching online and the stream just goes dead all of a sudden, this computer has just died and I have to reconnect. I'll do my best to reestablish connection before things go sideways. It worked earlier today for my other lecture without problems, but then, in the last 2 days, it'll just randomly do this. So yeah, I don't know, and hopefully it doesn't happen and it never happens again after the second round of reinstalling all the drivers, but who knows? I've had nothing but trouble with drivers on this thing. At one point, it lost its speakers. It was like, I don't have speakers. I can't make sound. And that was fun. So, yes, the midterm's on Monday. I can't believe it's almost midterm time. We have 2 more classes, right? So we have today and we have Friday. And Friday we're going to do some exam prep. And hopefully we won't have too much education stuff to finish. But yes, today is not the midterm. I'm sorry to scare you.
Maybe it was Friday and maybe February 2nd was Friday and I got
No, February 2nd is next Monday, right? So yes, definitely not for a couple of days, and you'll still have the weekend. Okay, so I know we're getting exam anxiety here. So it's 90 minutes to do the exam, and it's 5 short answer questions. So yeah, technically, right, you get 1.5 times the time that you have in class. So it's a little bit longer. So yeah, and it's 5 short answer questions. We'll talk about, hello, microphone, be my friend. We'll talk about what it looks like a little bit. Like I have some examples to kind of go through with you. And I'm hoping to do that next class. Okay, any chance you can get more time? People always want more time. It's never enough time, right? Generally speaking, I found that 90 minutes is a pretty good balance. It gives you a fair bit of time for each question, and it's more time than our actual class time. I also don't want to overburden people, because if I give people like 2 hours, then for some people that is an excessive amount of time. So I don't want to, carving out a 2-hour chunk of your schedule for an hour-long class can be a bit of a challenge for some people. So I don't want to make it too much. I'm sure everyone's complaining about having too much time. That's probably it. So I feel good about 90 minutes. And I think once you see it, you will too, I hope. Okay. Let's, what were we doing last time? Okay, so we were talking last time about education, right? And we only got a couple of slides in, which I won't go over in great detail again, talking about, why we care about education so much when we deal with youth, which is pretty obvious, right? That's where you're going to spend most of your lives as young people, is in school, probably from the time that you're somewhere between 4 and, all the way until you're 21, 22 years old at very least, for most people. 17 to 18 at very minimum. Okay, talked about this. I want to do this again, right? Talking about secondary school and kind of where, countries like Canada sit and how they're being judged, right? A little bit in these PISA rankings. Okay, so when it comes to, education, one of the things that tends to be a big concern, even, as we're in a period where the average amount of education that people are getting is increasing, right? And we talked about this like with our millennials. It's about 1/3 of them are getting a bachelor's degree. It's more than that if we talk about just post-secondary, right? It's about 2/3 if we include things like, 2-year certificates and trade schools, right? Everybody's dying. No, that's okay. In my other class today, it was like sneeze, sneeze. It was the symphony of sneezes. Oh, I love it when that happens. Okay. Are you okay?
I'm surviving.
Okay, good. A death in the classroom would be tragic, especially from such a easily avoidable cause. Okay, so we're getting more and more education, but dropout rates continue to be a big concern because amongst certain demographics, we're seeing, we see kind of fluctuations in high school dropout rates. Now, dropout rates have historically been one of these indicators of kind of the health of a society and an education system, specifically because for a really long time, we have seen high school as the sort of, like a high school diploma as your base credential, right? So your high school diploma, really since the baby boomers has been the base credential for getting into the job market, right? Without I'm sure you've seen old movies, right, where some kid is threatening to drop out of high school and the parents are like, what are you going to do without a high school diploma? This is changing a little bit. We'll talk about that in a sec. But dropout rates from high school in particular, and particularly for boys, right? No bother. Sorry. If I go too close to the top, I end up in a different screen, and I'll never figure out how to make that not happen. Okay, for boys, this is a particular concern because boys are more likely to drop out. Okay, now, dropout rates from high school tend to be really strongly correlated to social class and gender, right? Now, I have one friend and her middle son, she has 3 boys, and her middle son is technically qualified as like genius IQ, and he's the one who constantly threatens to drop out of high school, to which I'm like, not so smart, is he? He also kind of was paying for business advice from Andrew Tate's Hustler University using her credit card, and I'm like, I question his intelligence. She's like, he's really good at math, okay? He's really good at math. He's not really good at life. I'm like, okay, I can deal with that. But generally, when we're talking social class, right, working class and poor kids are the ones that are likely to drop out of high school, both male and female. But boys are somewhat more likely to drop out of high school than girls are. Okay, one of the things that tends to affect this, and the strongest sort of pull on high school dropout rates, tends to be macroeconomic factors, right? So, if you live in a place with a higher minimum wage, or more likely, higher entry-level wages, you tend to get higher dropout rates. So your highest dropout rates are going to typically be in what would be referred to by economists as overheated labor markets, right? Where demand exceeds supply. So if your labor market is overheated, right, there's too much demand and not enough supply, you have a kind of natural pull, right? Wages rise. You get wages going up and up and up in really hot labor markets. So what happens is young people, being, rational economic agents, look at the labor market. And they look at it, maybe they're in 11th or 12th grade, and they're like, if I drop out of school, I could make X amount of money working, whereas, if I finish school, I would lose a year of income, and, it wouldn't really change how much I can make when I get out, right? So, for example, back in around 2013, which is sort of at the peak of the last big oil boom in Alberta, right around where oil was running somewhere in the range of $100 a barrel, and the good times were a-rolling. If only we'd saved any of that money for a rainy day. Oh dear. The dropout rate, especially for boys, was around 25% were dropping out of high school, right? So this is a huge number. It's rare. And the reason they were doing this is because there were 6-figure jobs available to unskilled laborers in oil and gas, right? you could go off and work on an oil rig. And I actually had a cousin who did this. He finished high school, but the second he was out of high school, he went off and started working on the oil rigs. And immediately he was pulling down, I think it was like $115,000 a year as an unskilled laborer, right? Not one of the engineers who actually understands how the rig works, just what you would kindly refer to as a rig pig, right? Looking at him, you wouldn't think that. He's shorter than I am and extremely good looking. So rig pig would not likely be what you would think, but that's the label. Okay, so this obviously correlates most strongly in our lower socioeconomic classes because they are the ones for whom, things like post-secondary education, which is, strongly correlated with kind of values of their parents and future earnings, is unlikely to be attainable or even considered likely for them, right? They're likely the ones that are doing more poorly in school, have less supports, and there's less of a family history of attending post-secondary institutions. So you're going to see more of them dropping out of school to go to, into the market. And that's what tends to happen is, and this is exactly what happened in Alberta, you get a big freak out because it's like, oh my gosh, our high school dropout rate is enormously high. Government initiatives kind of try to address this, and then the economy cools, right? And then the rate drops down naturally because suddenly there's less opportunity. If no one's hiring, there's no point in you dropping out of high school, typically, right? Okay, now, Indigenous groups, right? First Nations, Inuit, Métis, though First Nations and Inuit are higher than Métis, drop out at like roughly twice the national average, and it's much higher for those living on reserve than those living, off reserve. So like if you take the whole average, it's about twice, I can't remember the exact number now off the top of my head, but for those living on reserve, it's even higher than twice the national average. Immigrant groups, particularly Asian and Southeast Asian immigrants, generally have very low dropout rates, often driven by parental pressure and sort of culture. And yeah, our dropout rates are marginally higher for men or for males than for females. Okay, so reasons for dropping out, vary quite a bit. When they've surveyed, people who have or done surveys and captured pictures of basically people. Sorry, the symphony of coughs. I don't know why that made me laugh. I'm sorry to laugh at your suffering. I will try and endeavor to be a better person. It's just funny. Cough, 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 cough. Who's next? No, okay. Yeah, so when we capture this in surveys, right, our principal social... I'm okay. Your coughing shouldn't make me laugh. It just does for some reason. What we tend to see is there's lots of different reasons. The principal one tends to be, and we've done like either quantitative or qualitative work on this, the number one is economic, right? Usually young people who drop out of school are doing it because of some kind of economic compulsion. Either they can make a lot of money and they don't see the purpose in staying in school, right? Because the rewards of staying in school are lower than the rewards of entering the job market immediately. That's a really, really typical one. And typically they are young people who are already having some kind of problem in school, right? They're having problems with attendance, often driven by the fact that maybe they have to work in order to, either support themselves or help support family. And then, that leads to problems with school staff, right? So these are generally our young people who are having more trouble to begin with. And yeah, those who are in subcultures tend to have more, especially visible ones, tend to have more, a higher dropout rate because they tend to be more targeted by school administrations. So you coughed there and I didn't even laugh. Now, generally speaking, when you kind of survey people, in the short term, they tend to think of dropping out as a positive experience because usually it involves going to work, making some money, and feeling independent. The longer you go from the moment they dropped out into the future's over here, the more ambiguous or negative it tends to be. because what's pretty clear is that earnings power becomes severely limited once the further on you go, right? And that those who did get further education will tend to do better in the long term. So, dropping out often a good experience at first, but then when you realize that, on average, someone without a high school diploma kind of tops out in terms of wages at about $44,000 a year, which is right around the poverty line in Canada, you realize that over time is not a tremendously positive experience. Okay. So, post-secondary education. All of you are here, right? You're all doing post-secondary education, so I think you generally understand what it is for. On the whole, right, we've seen a long period of increasing demand for post-secondary education. There is some signs that, numbers of enrollments are starting to soften. This is not largely driven by the fact that people don't think, say, university is worth it anymore, although we'll talk about, young men. There's a little bit of a case to be made there. But broadly, one of the things that we're seeing is that, our cohort that's kind of come into the universities in the last, 15-ish years is Gen Z, and Gen Z is a really small cohort, right? They're a small generational cohort, so there's just fewer of them than there were millennials, right? We saw this huge bump in enrollments with millennials, and it's sort of now doing this little slow decline as Gen Z comes into the education market, or the post-secondary education market. But on the whole, right, for generations, we've seen increasing demand for post-secondary education driven by changes in the economy that demand more education. Okay, so this is coming kind of two waves. One is just, the population of places like Canada and the US deciding that post-secondary education was the path to a better life, and therefore more of them enrolling in universities, colleges, and such. And then a second push that sort of starts somewhere around the late 90s, 2000s, where a lot of developing countries start to, their middle class becomes well developed, and they want to send, they realize the same thing, right? They have the same kind of idea as people in the West do, that post-secondary education is going to be the pathway to, their children's wealth, and they want their kids to go to universities, but there are not enough spots in universities in the developing world, and the universities of the West are considerably more prestigious for the most part. Even, shall we say, a mid-tier school like U of A, I said it, I'm sorry. A mid-tier school like U of A is considerably more prestigious than a lot of schools in developing countries, right? So, my friends who went to University of Toronto will be pleased that I finally admitted the place of U of A. Don't tell them, please. So this has led to a big kind of increase in the number of enrollments in universities from international students. The other thing, as this line, so this has happened, right? So as this has happened, right, we get this slow Gen Z decline in enrollments. Post-secondary institutions have tried to make up that gap and even increase revenues by enrolling international students who pay considerably more for entry into these universities, right? And this is a big crisis, not so much in Alberta. Alberta got on this train, but not as much in Ontario. If you go to Ontario, right, there's whole universities that basically leaned into the international student strategy. And when the federal government said, you have too many international students, we're capping the number that we permit in, some of these universities in Ontario and Quebec have come to basically the verge of collapse, right? In terms of enrollments and therefore revenues and therefore their ability to continue, which, in the next few years, it's entirely possible we'll see universities in Ontario and Quebec actually collapse and possibly either need bailouts or they will close their doors. So, other things that have happened, and this is kind of cyclical, more focus on vocational training. Governments especially like to push vocational training. The most common one here is apprenticeships, but other types of vocational training are also things that governments really, really like to fund. So other kind of vocational trainings would be anything that leads directly to a career. So this could be things like teaching, nursing, medicine, dentistry, right? These are all vocational kind of paths that all kind of, if you're doing a education degree, that you're going to be a teacher. If you're doing a, dental hygienist degree, that you're going to be a dental hygienist, right? Big push for these because as opposed to, say, your general arts degree, you kind of know where that person's going to end up. And it tends to be seen as a bit of a safer investment than, say, general arts or general science. All right, the other big push is more part-time students upgrading specific skills for existing jobs. This has long been like new computer skills that come along, and I almost guarantee you the one that's going to come into the market, we're already seeing it kind of trickle in, is going to be retraining for AI. Because it's going to be like, you need to learn how to do AI in order to stay relevant. And there's going to be a bunch of courses that spring up that are like, how to use AI in the workplace. And, people are going to go and take these courses to try and stay current on important skills. Okay, hang on. Do I have a question slide? Man, I had no question slides for a while. Okay, so, what's that? Too much. Yeah, let's just wait. It'll cost more later. You're still getting in on the one of the middle floors. I got in more on the bottom floor. You're getting in on the middle floor. Imagine, once the costs get really high. Okay, rising cost of education means we tend to see an ever-increasing class divide, right? Where your middle class and your rich are able to access it more easily than the working class and poor, right? So lots of things, kind of speak to this, but one, and we refer to this as the intergenerational transfer of advantage. Those with higher income parents, those that are more likely to have been educated in a post-secondary institution, are also more likely to attend university, right? So it's something like, if one parent completed a bachelor's degree, you're twice as likely to yourself attend university. And for each additional year that your parents were in school, it's something like a 10% increase in your likelihood of completing university, right? So more educated parents that tend to have higher income because they're more educated, then push those values onto their kids who then go to university, and you get this kind of class divide, right? Okay. In Canada, it's not yet crippling, right? Average debt load, and sorry, this is as of 2021, was about $20,000 for university and $13,000 for a community college or a regional college kind of setup, right? Something like, I guess now it's called Red Deer Polytechnic or Grand Prairie Regional College, right? Those are considerably cheaper, and so people who get certification from those, save about $7,000 in terms of average debt loads. In the US, it's cuckoo banana birds, like almost everything in the US, but it's not even either, right? Now, some of these numbers, I guess, are like 5-6 years old. I didn't look them up today. I usually go over them and see if I can find more recent numbers. But you have varying levels of college and university in the US that all have different kind of amounts that come with them, right? So if you go to a community college in the US, at least as of 2021, right, average tuition for a year was about a little under $4,000. A state college for state residents, right? So you're going to the University of Minnesota and you live in Minnesota. Average tuition is about, $26,000, $27,000 a year. So still a considerable amount, right? Still out of reach for a lot of people. For a non-state resident, right? So you go to, University of Missouri. Why would anyone go to University of Missouri? Let's try that one again. Private nonprofit college, something like University of Notre Dame, you're going to end up spending about $50,000, $55,000 bucks. And if you go to an Ivy League school, right? So Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Brown, University of Pennsylvania. There might be another one that I'm forgetting, but who cares? None of us get to go to those places except to visit. You're looking at around $65,000 a year just for tuition. Now, if you include things like living expenses and books, easily rises, somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000, for these three categories. So that is a considerable chunk of change, right? You could easily drop in a four-year degree $400,000, which is, a house somewhere. Maybe not in Alberta anymore, but it is a house somewhere. Okay, so lots of money, right? Okay, so that has meant that many young people start out their working lives with large debts. Now, I will say, what the statistics suggest is that the bulk of that debt is held by those who hold masters and PhDs, which is a small percentage of the overall people. So they hold considerably more, right? Because you're adding, 2 years at least for a master's and 4. Oops, I did not mean to do that. Why can't I do that when I want to do it, but I can? And now how do I undo it? There we go. There's some sorcery in my pen that allows that to happen. 4 to, infinity, but I'll just say 6 years for a PhD, right? So those extra years of school really kill people and really bite into, especially later earning power. You do tend to earn more, but often not that much more, that it would be worth it. So they hold the bulk of the student debt in the US and are typically the ones who complain the most about it. Okay. What all this student debt has tended to mean, and the argument that's been made by those who call for student debt forgiveness, that's not a word, forgiveness, is that, or maybe it is, I don't know, look it up. This often puts life on the back burner. So then when we talk later about questions of like marriage, family, and all that jazz, right? That all these things have to be put on hold while students pay, the debt they accrued while in university. Okay. Now the fun thing about student loans, and hopefully if you have student loans, you know this. If you don't, I'll tell you. In Canada, student debt is dischargeable in bankruptcy only 7 years following the end of the last year in which the person attended any type of schooling, right? So from the day you graduate, the bank gets you for 7 years, right? So you could declare bankruptcy 6 times in that period, and you still wouldn't be able to discharge that debt, right? So they'd still be like, nope, you still have to make those payments. Since the 90s, this has been managed by the big 5 banks in Canada. So that's Royal TD, Bank of Montreal, CIBC, and Scotia. And they are vicious about collecting. So, pay your student loans or they will come after you. And obviously, this is a big problem because increasingly it's necessary. And we'll talk about it a little bit in this unit. We'll talk about it after the midterm when we talk about work. But increasingly, right, access to that basic tier of the job market, it used to be the high school diploma, not anymore. Today, increasingly, just to access that base tier, it's your bachelor's degree that you need, right? Even for really, really silly jobs. Okay, now, if you think you've got it bad, your American confreres, student debt is non-dischargeable in the US, ever, right? So, in the US, you cannot, if you take out a student loan, you can declare bankruptcy 1,000 times. You cannot get rid of that debt. Once you come out of bankruptcy, you're still going to have to pay for it. It's non-dischargeable. This is largely because in order to get people better access to student loans, the US government worked with the banks in the US to say, okay, here's the thing. When you get a degree, let's say you buy a house, right? If you buy a house and you don't make your payments, the bank comes and takes your house. if you borrow money to get a degree and you don't make payments on the money you borrowed to get that degree, the bank can't take your degree, nor would that be useful to the bank, having your degree. Bank managers would have a lot of degrees in their offices, but what use would that be, right? So because there's no asset, the tendency has been for banks to be like, yeah, we're not interested in making student loans. So governments, to try and get more people through the university system, have said, okay, we'll make you a deal. You give out the loans and we'll make them non-dischargeable. In Canada, thankfully, and you might not feel this way, but thankfully, 7 years is not that long. You can't discharge it for 7 years. In the US, you can never discharge it. The only way to get out of that debt is to die. Not recommended. 1 out of 5 stars, would not recommend. Okay, so the cost of education has been, sorry, I swallowed a piece of ice from my cup, and if I chew, it'll like make crunching sounds in the microphone, so I also have to choke on it and then cough like everyone else. Okay, we see here, right, the cost of education has been growing. If we tracked, and these are US numbers, right? So basically, cost of education, if we go back to 1964, per year was about $8,000 on average. It's tracked up to an average rate, including all things like community college and everything, of about a little bit over $20,000 a year. Obviously, you can get much higher depending on the type of school you go to. This is far faster, I think about 3 times the overall rate of inflation. So it's gone much quicker and it's risen much faster than median wages as well. So the cost of education is skyrocketing. And here, this is plotted out by Twenge. The cost of things like grants and loans, or the amount available in grants and loans, hasn't risen nearly as quickly, right? So the cost of education is increasingly borne by families, right? Parents having to sometimes take out second mortgages, or taking out a bunch of debt, home equity lines of credit on properties they own to get their kids through university, which is obviously a problem. I mean, yes, but maybe they're coughing, maybe they're happy coughs. I don't know. Coughs of joy. But yes, you could stay home. You don't need to infect us. The cost, my cousin is in dentistry in Minnesota and pays $95,000 yearly tuition, not including living expenses and books. So dentistry is a special program, right? Even dentistry here is more expensive than regular tuition, not $95,000 a year expensive. How shall we say this? Dentists can make a lot of money. I don't want to say dentists are dishonest. I have a friend who is a dentist, and he has been on the review board for other dentists, and he tells me, like, before you get any dental work done, just come to me and ask me if you really need it. Because in his opinion, a lot of dentists will, because they carry so much debt, they will charge you out the something. Outrageous prices. They will do dental work you don't need. So, I'm ruining your trust in dentists. What am I doing? They're con men. No, what? No, dentists, there's like huge costs involved, and buying a dental practice and all that equipment is super expensive. So there can be some dishonesty that goes on in the dentistry industry. Beware, don't trust. Is there not a loan forgiveness program in the US? There are always how shall we say, promises made, especially on the Democratic side. We're going to forgive student loans. We're going to forgive student loans. And I think the Biden administration tried it. And they tried to forgive $20,000 in student loans. And I think it got struck, if I'm recalling it, it got struck down by the Supreme Court saying basically, yeah, you can't do that. You can't just basically transfer the cost of those loans onto the federal government, right? Because somebody has to pay the bank back. Trust me. Banks do not you can't just, as the government, say, yeah, you don't owe that money anymore. Someone has to pay it. So it's never gone through, and even $20,000 is often not enough. Okay. Yes, all right, I'm in the right place. A lot of this, right, the push towards more education is driven by a phenomenon that we refer to as educational inflation. So here's what educational inflation is, right? So you know what inflation is, I hope. right? Inflation is, essentially the value when your same dollar, because of rising prices, doesn't buy you as much stuff, right? So, a couple of years ago, you could get away with, spending, a family of five, $200 on groceries a week. Today, it costs, well, let's say considerably more than that. It's expensive, right? That's inflation. Your same dollar buys less. Educational inflation is kind of like that, but with whatever credentials you happen to have. And what's happened generally, and generally one of the things that causes monetary inflation is the government prints more money, lowering the value of that money. In the education space, it's a similar type of phenomenon. The governments, right, and universities have essentially printed more degrees, right? More people have degrees today. More degrees, right? Which, on the whole, probably a good thing. But what that has meant is that those degrees are increasingly worth less in the job market, right? So if we go back in time, right, back to even just like the 80s, the 1980s, right? A high school diploma, that was your base. To get into decent jobs in the job market, you needed a high school diploma. So you could go through your, grade 12, get your high school diploma, and you could probably go off, if you're a male, you would go off to a factory or to some trade and start working and make a decent living, maybe even get lucky and work for a company like Ford, GM, Chrysler, and get IBM, and get a pension. That isn't possible anymore, right? The high school diploma doesn't get you anything. And what happened in the interim is we start, largely, governments looked at this and they said, hey, what we notice is that those with, bachelor's degrees make more money. So if we want to increase people's wages, right, well, what we should do is get more people bachelor's degrees. So they started pushing people through university programs. And what happened is, weirdly, eventually the bachelor's degree came to be the base credential, right? So even jobs that really don't require a bachelor's degree of any kind increasingly are asking people for a bachelor's degree. I'll tell you two really quick stories about this. So I have one friend, right? So his name is Josh. And he was doing his degree at the U of A in economics, and he sort of flunked out, right? He got to econometrics, and econometrics is really, really hard, right? It's like math, but harder. And he flunked out of econometrics. And he sort of, around the same time, he met his wife. And his wife's dad owned a company, right? So, he's like kind of between places, not sure what he's going to do. And so his father-in-law, future father-in-law, offers him a job at this company. He goes to work for it, and he spends 15 years working as a project manager for his father-in-law's company, but never finishes the bachelor's degree. So his father-in-law hits retirement age and is like, I want to cash out all the equity I've built up in this company. So he sells it to his partner. Partner doesn't like my friend Josh. They never quite, Josh is very swiftly sort of said, here's your buyout package. Here's $70,000. Go find yourself another job. Josh, with 15 years of project manager experience, applies literally everywhere for 2 years, only to be told we only hire people with a degree. And you don't have a degree, but I have 15 years experience. That doesn't matter. We only hire people with a degree, right? So it had become, in that interim, the sort of base criteria for hiring, right? Experience didn't matter. In fact, a lot of times he wouldn't even talk to people because the fact that he didn't have a bachelor's degree when that CV hit HR, it was just like, nope, not even looking at it, right? Don't care how much experience you have. You're not the kind of person we're looking for. That's what educational inflation looks like, right? And it gets worse. Okay, and I'll tell you one other very quick story because it's about my own personal trauma. I only have 10 minutes, but we'll make it through the education stuff in time to talk turkey about the exam on Friday. When I got out of university, like when I finished my bachelor's degree, I immediately kind of went to work. I didn't go straight into grad school. I went to work and I got a couple of jobs, and finally I landed one at, of all places, Enterprise Rent-A-Car. Now, I will just warn you, if you ever think about working at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, don't. It sucks. They make you do all sorts of crazy things. But I remember talking to the manager who hired me, and he's like, yeah, we only hire people with at least a bachelor's degree. He's like, we might consider someone with a 2-year certificate, but we'd really rather have a bachelor degree. And to this day, and I worked there for 3 years, as everything from like, a management trainee, because that's the base position, all the way up to a branch manager. And I swear to God, I could never figure out why you needed a bachelor's degree to work there, because it mostly involved filling out forms, right, and washing cars. But it had become the base credential, almost like an IQ test. See, like if you have a bachelor's degree, well, you have the gumption and the stamina to get through hard tasks. So that's what we're looking for, right? Okay, so what we are seeing is the value of a bachelor's degree is declining overall. I'm sorry, because I know you're all working on your bachelor's degrees right now. The other thing that's happened is, as governments became convinced that the bachelor's degree was the path to a great future prosperity, they allowed more institutions to grant them. So when not that long ago, I graduated from my BA in 2005, right? There was one school in Edmonton that could grant bachelor's degrees, and that was U of A. Today, right, 20-ish years later, I'm trying to count, MacEwan, King's, Concordia University of Edmonton, and U of A. So we're now up to 4 degree-granting institutions as of, let's say, 2025. All right, 2026, because that's where we are, right? And all that does is it pumps out more degrees, and largely employers don't care where your degree comes from, unless you're in the US and you went to an Ivy League school. Mostly they don't care where your degree is from, just that you have a degree, because it's just the base credential. Okay, so depression. And here's my little chart. Mid-20th century, a BA or a bachelor's degree tended to land you a fairly high status job, right? We'll talk about this more when we talk about work after the midterm, but your chance of landing in like civil service or a nice corporate bureaucracy with a bachelor's degree of any kind was pretty good. And your high school diploma was the base. Today, to get those really sweet jobs, increasingly, you're needing a master's degree, right? Because more employees are like, well, bachelor's degree, everybody's got one of those. I'm really looking for a master's degree. Okay, I don't know why I did that voice. It's kind of great though. Okay. And yeah, the PhD increasingly is what a master's degree was 20 years ago. Now that's all well and nice, right? But, that is, let's say, to get to the same place that you were here back in the late 90s, that's at least an additional 2 years of school. And to really get to those high, like super high status jobs that you could get with a master's, well, now you're at a 4 to 6, right? So the amount of education you need definitely increases. And this is going to push back a lot of other sort of things people might want to do with their lives that, we might also want to value. Oh yeah, this one is my favorite, because when I finished my PhD, everyone was telling me, to get that tenure track job at a university, you're going to have to do 1 or maybe 2 postdoctoral fellowships. I don't want to tell you the words I used to answer that person when they told me that, but it was not exactly polite, because by that point I had had quite enough, right? So yeah, lots of people are now, PhD is the new master's, a postdoc is the new PhD, but often 2, right? And I have a few friends who went on to much greater academic fame than I have. But my one friend, she went through 3 postdocs before finally landing her tenure track position. And postdocs kind of suck, because you're still working for someone. The wages are really, really low. Like I looked at doing one at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and it was like, you will get paid $25,000 US a year. And I'm like, you could go get, not that they offered it to me, but that would have been my response even if they had. Okay, how am I doing for time? My story's notwithstanding. All right, I already told you this, so I will, because sometimes I get ahead of myself. Academic attainment and eventual employment attainment really strongly tied to family background. Oh, I got the number wrong. I said 10. It's 5. Every additional year of school parents have means a 5% greater chance of a child attending university, right? And here's my stupid joke. For me, that my children have 145% chance by this calculus. Though I've told my kids, very much like, do what you want, and university is not the be-all, end-all. If you want to be a pastry chef, go do that. I would really like it. I really like pastries, so if one of them wants to be a pastry chef, I'm all in. All right. Largely, this seems to be driven by social class concerns, right? Status is largely tied to education, right? So we want our kids to maintain status, maintain our same social class. We tend to attribute our success in life to the things we did, and so we push them in the same direction. Okay, how many slides do I have left here? It's at 4 minutes. I just want to make sure. Oh, all right, we can do a couple more. There's some fun stuff here, and then we'll have lots of time to review on Friday. All right, so social class. If you've ever heard, about the book Outliers, this is a book by Malcolm Gladwell, where he talks about the 10,000-hour rule. That's what he's really, really famous for. One of the things that he suggests is that what happens with, and this, we'll talk about this too when we talk about families, because Melissa Kearney, the economist, I think she's at Notre Dame economist, talks about this as well, is social class plays a really big role in education. Children from higher incomes, right? A couple of things. Their parents are more likely to be married, right? And children from households with married parents have a huge number of advantages. Big ones are things like they have higher literacy rates, right? They have, they live in higher income families. They spend more time with their parents are more supportive, and all sorts of things, right? Their parents are more engaged, and, there's two of them, right, in the household. And so they have more ability to provide their children with more advantages, right? So children from upper social classes, more likely to have married parents. Married parents bring a ton of advantages with them. So their rates of literacy are higher, their numeracy rates are higher. Their educational aspiration and eventual attainment is higher, right? They want more education, and they get more education, and they tend to do better in the job market. And upper class parents, right, upper income parents, are more likely to practice a type of parenting that's typically been referred to as, I'm blanking on what it's referred to as, no, it's not natural growth, that's the other one, concerted cultivation. I'm just going to write CC, concerted cultivation, where you teach your children how to navigate through the world, right? You give them opportunities to navigate the world, and you build up their skills, right? So you enroll them in activities that they find meaningful and they like, and you build up their skills so that by the time they're adults, they bring a lot with them, right? So you can foster a lot of qualities in your kids. Okay, I can do this one very quickly. So credentialism, right? I'll talk about this next time. We'll start with this. Yeah, I'll just say this really quickly, and we're going to talk about this next class and then go into exam prep. From Gen X, right, we've seen more and more people being college educated, but increasingly the shift has been away from things like the social sciences and humanities, right, towards more degrees that provide better credentials, right? And increasingly, we've seen a shift and a push, especially towards, what's called the STEM fields, science, technology, education, and math, where, governments seem to think that there is a lot of value to be had, right? And a lot of really high value jobs come from these fields, right? So, largely driven by, we want to make a lot of money, we don't care as much about ideas, right? Money rises, ideas go down. We've seen a kind of push into fields of education that are going to give you a credential that helps you make a lot of money. Okay, I am now officially out of time, I believe. Yes. We are in range. I will answer these next time. I'm sorry. I did not have enough question slides. Yes, we will answer these next time. And then we will do my last few slides and exam prep. Have a great day. Do I have repeats? No, okay, I'm good.